Tonight's presentation on the topic of phenology is Theresa Crimmins. Theresa is the director of the USA National Phenology Network and works enthusiastically to support growth in Nature's Notebook and also to promote a broader appreciation of phenology among scientists and non-scientists alike. She is an associate professor in the School of National Resources and Environment at the University of Arizona and has published over 70 peer-reviewed articles and book chapters. Theresa's writing has appeared in Scientific American, The Hill, EOS, Nautilus, Popular Science, and more. And she has had several appearances on NPR as well as PBS, The Weather Channel, and Fox Weather. Her book, Phenology, came out last spring, and her TEDx talk is available online. So without any further ado, Theresa, welcome, and the Zoom screen is yours.
There we go. Okay, thank you so much. I was just telling everybody I'm really good at handling Zoom, and then I couldn't unmute myself. It's so fantastic to be here with you all tonight. Thank you so much. And so yes, as Barry and Anne so kindly said, I'm here to talk with you about phenology. So I'd love to start with trying to get a sense of the audience, which is always tricky when we're all online. But Anne very kindly agreed to trying to launch a poll that we cooked up really fast. Specifically, I lead a program called the USA National Phenology Network, and we lead a platform called Nature's Notebook. And I'm really curious to know how many of you have familiarity of any degree to this platform. Okay, we've got a few folks who are participants. It's looking like 3 of you so far are Nature's Notebook participants, so thank you so much. A good chunk of you are curious and have heard of it, and many have not. So that's great. Okay, thank you so much. I think if I just click end poll, oh, there you go. Now you guys can see, right? I'm not very good with the polls. So yes, very few folks today are actually participants. All the rest, hopefully, very excited to learn about it. So that's the plan for tonight. All right, so to back up a little bit, I was sharing with Barry and Anne how delighted I was to get to think about prairies. The fact that your chapter is titled the Prairie chapter made me very happy because a long time ago, this is like 30 years ago now, for my master's thesis, I studied tallgrass prairie restoration at the Kalamazoo Nature Center in Southwest Michigan. And this is actually a picture of their prairie restoration as I think it stands pretty recently. So as I was going through the data, some of the data in your region, I was encountering plants like compass plant and black-eyed Susan and prairie smoke, and it just made me feel very nostalgic for my old friends. But this is what it looks like where I am now, which is in southern Arizona. I'm based at the University of Arizona, so it's the Sonoran Desert, and it's very different. Um, and this is some of the sites I have seen very recently. It's been an interesting year for us. All of last year was exceedingly dry up until the very tail end of the year, where we finally got some rain in October and November and December. And now when I went out for some hikes over Christmas break, we actually had some water flowing in some of the stream channels, which was such a welcome sight. And amazingly, the mosses, like you see in the upper left corner there, were so green. They're greener than I've ever seen them. They were so happy. Usually they're all dried up and looking dead, and you pour a little water on. They come to life in a matter of moments, but they are all just lush, so lush. Some plants were flowering. Interestingly, we saw some tarantulas out and about. We saw some butterflies. And all of that caused me to wonder, this is interesting. This is what was really puzzling about it is that our seasonality is different here. We do typically have a rainy season in the winter, and what typically happens is that triggers plants and animal activity to initiate in the spring. And while our spring is a bit earlier than what you all are accustomed to there, it's still a spring. I usually think of spring as beginning in, say, February. And so seeing this plant activity, buds on the trees, insects out, arthropods out, made me start to ask people, what's going on? Is this late? Is it late from last fall or is it early for this spring? And it seems like maybe it's a mix of both, partly because we had a very warm December. December, I think, was the warmest December we've ever had. And then this funky rain that has been falling in seasons, in months where we don't usually have it. And so what it's causing is things to happen at kind of surprising times. So there's two things that I mentioned there that actually constitute the definition of phenology. Really, what it refers to is when things are happening seasonally in plants and animals. So those recurring events that we have happen over the arc of a year, like leaf out or flowering, emergence in the case of insects, well, emergence for arthropods like tarantulas that typically overwinter underground. And also phenology refers to when migratory species either depart or arrive on their wintering or their breeding grounds, or even things that hibernate over the winter when they enter into hibernation or diapause and when they come out of it. And if you think about it for a minute, it makes sense that those things are driven by other conditions. We kind of intuit this, even if we don't think about it in great detail. The timing of those events varies typically from one year to the next. And the reason why it tends to vary is because what causes those events to occur is what recent conditions have been. And oftentimes it has a lot to do with either temperature or moisture or sun angle. Those are the three largest, most influential variables. And so as those conditions are changing, we're seeing increasingly more variable conditions from one year to the next. We're seeing more variation in when a lot of these events are occurring. So let's back up just a second because there's really kind of two things that are driving when stuff happens. And part of it's very predictable and part of it's less predictable. This is what's driving the predictable part. We all live on this planet that is revolving around the sun. And it's a fixed ellipse. It takes 365.4 days to get around the sun and make a whole revolution, and that's a year. And if you remember to your elementary school geoscience lesson, the Earth is rotating on an axis that's 23.5 degrees from orthogonal to the sun, to the ellipse around the sun. And that causes part of the planet to be pointed toward the sun or away from the sun, depending on where we are going around the sun. And that is what causes our days to be longer in the summer in the northern hemisphere and shorter in the winter. And also that has a lot to do with what drives temperature. So the day length varies very predictably from one day to the next and one year to the next. But then it gets more complicated because we have an atmosphere, and that's a fabulous thing because that's what makes it possible for life to be present on Earth. However, it makes things much more complicated conditions-wise. The fact that we have this lovely layer of gases and moisture encompassing us like a blanket is good, but because the Earth is rotating, it causes all these complicated air masses to do all sorts of wild things that I can't really describe very well. And that leads to weather. And as we all know from watching the Weather Channel from one day to the next, even though we have incredibly smart people and very high-powered models and forecasts, we still can't actually do that good of a job at predicting what the weather is going to be on any given day. And that's because things are really complicated. Those two things combined lead to seasonal events in plants and animals have been happening generally at a predictable time. Like we can attribute leaf out typically to the spring season, but then which exact day it's going to happen on varies a lot from one year to the next because of all the reasons why weather is hard to predict. What's cool is that we have evidence that humans have paid attention to when stuff has happened for as long as we have records of human activity. And this slide here is showing some of the records that we have from cave paintings dating back to like 50,000 years. I think these ones are from Europe. And some anthropologists or archaeologists, excuse me, just recently published some papers saying that they feel like they cracked the code. They noticed that in a lot of cave paintings, these are paintings from a lot of different caves, they saw repeated symbols and like dashes and dots and things, but they didn't know what it meant. And through a lot of triangulation and I don't really know magic, smart things, they figured out that actually they believe that those symbols are referring to when particular events are occurring, things like when particular migratory animals are expected to be present or not present, when animals are giving birth, when particular fish species are available. And they think that those dashes and dots refer to the moons, which is a way of keeping track of where you are in the course of the year. And we have a lot of evidence too, even in our present day, I'll say like gardening lore, or even more than lore, a lot of the wisdom actually that is shared around, sometimes casually, sometimes less casually, about when to take particular actions. We can trace it back to folks who had lived on the planet from a very long time ago and had, through direct experience, figured out how different events are tied to conditions and how that varies over the course of the year. And so in the gardening world, we have actually a lot of these, sometimes they're referred to as wives' tales, but they're actually very legitimate information, again, born out of wisdom. Things like plant corn when the oak leaves are the size of a squirrel's ear. And the reason that actually works in a lot of cases, in a lot of places, especially in the eastern US, these recommendations actually bear out, and you can kind of walk it back and realize that it has everything to do with what were the conditions that were preceding those events. You know, what are the conditions that need to be present in order for oak leaves to start to break bud and start to emerge? They don't actually happen until we are fairly far into the spring season. We're past the risk of frost. We're well into when seeds can be put in the ground safely, and you don't have to risk that they'll rot because they'll sit there for too long before they germinate. And also, it's early enough in the year that your corn crop could actually mature and produce abundant fruit. And so that's kind of the optimal window to plant your crop. And it really is indirectly tied to what those conditions are like. We have written records in other parts of the world, less so here in the US. In some other parts of the world, though, we have records that go back ridiculously long. These are records of when the cherry trees in Japan flower, and this record stretches all the way back until the 800s. This plot here is showing an uninterrupted record that folks have kept in Kyoto, Japan since the mid 800s, so over 1200 years. And what's being plotted here, the year is on the x-axis here. So we're looking at a time series. And the day of year that the cherry trees were considered to be in full bloom or full open flowers is what's on the y-axis here. And so each pink dot represents the day of peak bloom for a particular year. And what we see, we've got this jiggly black line in here that's a moving average. What we see is that for many hundreds of years, well, first of all, we see that this is an insanely long, thorough record. It's remarkable, and this is the best long-term phenological record we know of anywhere in the globe. We see a lot of variability from year to year. Peak flower happens anywhere from the late March to late March to early May, and that it varies a lot from one year to the next. And then we get over here into the right side of the plot where we hit kind of the 1850s or so, right about when we get to the Industrial Revolution, which is really that point in time where we started to burn a whole lot of coal and wood and be pumping carbon dioxide and soot and other things into the atmosphere. And we didn't stop. We have kept accelerating the rate at which we're doing that ever since. And what we see is that moving average drifts downward toward what that means is, and that's because all the peak bloom dates are progressively occurring earlier and earlier. And this actually ends in 2021. I hope that they update it soon because I know that the most recent years are all clumped down here too. And what we're seeing here is that with the onset of the pumping stuff into the atmosphere has led to progressively earlier blooming among cherry trees in Japan. And that plot there lines up really well when we start to look at global temperatures too. What this plot is showing is the anomaly of the global average temperature in each year, going from basically that Industrial Revolution to present. It's actually starting at 1880 here. And so what this plot comes from NASA, and what they did was they calculated the average global temperature in each year, and then they took the middle section of it. So you'll see that what they use as the baseline is the average global temperature from 1950 to 1980, which is kind of just the middle of the period here. And then they take the average global temperature in each single year and difference it from that average 30-year period. And so if a line is blue and pointing downward, it means that that particular year's average global temperature was cooler than that 1951 to 1980 average. And if it's if it's pointing upwards and it's orange or red, then that year's global temperature was warmer than that period. And what we see is a pretty clear pattern here of it was the first part of the record was cooler than that average period, and it's been warmer ever since, pretty much without a whole lot of variation there. And again, if this plot were extended, we would only see taller, darker red bars in every year here. So basically, when we put these two things together, we see that global average temperatures are increasing pretty steadily, and the cherry blossoms are flowering progressively earlier, pretty steadily. And so that was fascinating when scientists started to put this together. And it really was only in about the 1980s and 1990s that this even started to come to bear. It was around that time where scientists were beginning to kind of sound the alarm that global average temperatures were increasing, that there became this awareness that we might be able to see the response of that change in biological activity. And phenology really started to kind of slowly come to the forefront of global change science for that reason. And so we have now increasingly more evidence stacking up from all parts of the globe and a whole lot of different species and among different events that occur all through the year, not just the springtime stuff like flowering, but also leaf color change and leaf drop in the autumn. The timing of those kinds of events is shifting as well. And so we are starting to kind of paint a picture about what's going on. And I wanted to try to come up with a global assessment or evaluation of what that all looks like, in mass based on what all we have. And the best I could muster when I tried to look across all these different studies was that basically when we look at all the different species and all the different places, just in the recent few decades, since the 1980s, if we focus on springtime activity, globally we see an average of a shift of about 4 days earlier of stuff. That might not sound like a whole lot, but that is an average value. And that's where it starts to get interesting, is because an average is an average over usually a wide range of actual values. So some things are shifting a great deal and some things are not at all. And that's where we start to have interesting consequences. Okay, so first of all, how do we know what is the information that we're working with for even evaluating this? We have really fantastic records like that cherry blossom record out of Kyoto, but honestly, long-term records like that precede an acknowledgement that things are changing are few and far between, because most monitoring systems haven't come online until we started to realize that things were changing, because things were changing, we thought we better track them. And so we actually have to get pretty creative for trying to piece together what was the story and when were plants and animals historically undergoing their seasonal activity prior to us changing the conditions of the globe to a great extent. And interestingly, and this is where some of my research falls, we can draw from things like people's journals. It's really pretty fascinating that, again, this is hard. This is finding like a needle in the haystack kind of scenario, but sometimes it's possible to track down records that people made simply because they really enjoyed watching nature and keeping track of things. And sometimes those can be really good insights into the past. I won't go into detail, but because I'm not sure, probably some of you are aware, Henry David Thoreau, our friend who wrote Civil Disobedience, actually was one of those people who took extremely thorough, careful, meticulous records on what was happening when plants were flowering and when birds were arriving at Walden Pond. And it wasn't until, almost 200 years after he died that somebody happened to recognize, oh, wait, what? We have these diaries and this data is super valuable. So we're still trying to unearth that from any place we can. Satellites are another good source, although kind of in contrast with the records with diaries and things, satellites really only came online in the 1970s at best. So that's a relatively short period of record. Um, Observations made by both professionals and volunteers is huge. And so that's why I was asking you about Nature's Notebook, because that's one of the platforms that is starting to generate really valuable data about when things are happening. And then really fascinating, scientists are also doing their best to get creative with records that weren't necessarily collected for the purpose, again, of tracking phenology, but maybe were collected for other reasons that we can now repurpose. And one of the best examples of that is herbarium specimens. And maybe you all know what those are, but just in case, they are pressed plant specimens that were historically and actually still collected, typically for reasons of either documenting where species are found, so understanding their range, or even going back even further in time, it usually was just for taxonomic purposes, for cataloging, for understanding what species even existed and where they were and what they were and how they were related. And so for those reasons, usually when herbarium specimens are collected, they usually have as many structures on them as possible. So flowers at a minimum, and sometimes even fruits if they can be attached. And the wonderful thing about these specimens is that when they're collected, they always have this little information card attached, which has both the date it was collected and the location where it was collected. Sometimes the location is a bit fuzzy. Sometimes it's like Livingston County, which is kind of vague, but it at least gives you a sense of generally where and definitely when. And in this case, I can't tell what plant this is. It was open, flowers were open and leaves were present. And that is phenological information. And it is a point in time. And when we amass enough of these together, it can start help us to piece together a picture of when things were or were not happening. Okay, so I had said on average, things are shifting their springtime activity by about 4 days. But again, that's an average. And for fun, I'm just going to skim the surface here, but to give you an example of how there's variability encapsulated in that, this is an example where some really amazing historical records were discovered in New York State that were documented through a network that was established at academic institutions that harken all the way back to way prior to the Civil War. The 1820s is, I think, when this network was first established. And by comparing those records of when different trees, it was primarily trees, when trees at that time flowered and leafed out to records that have been collected in recent years, we can with a high degree of confidence, calculate that tulip tree, which is, I love it so much. It's one of my favorites. It now flowers almost a month sooner in that part of the world in New York than it did back in the early 1800s. And so we don't even know, honestly, what all the consequences are for that. But if, for example, its pollinators haven't shifted their activity to that same degree, it may be getting pollinated by different species than it did a couple hundred years ago. And there could be many other implications as well. But interestingly, those values, those giant numbers, don't persist across every location and every species. Another tree, horse chestnut, in Switzerland has another really, really strong uninterrupted record. And interestingly, in that part of the world, the leaf out has shifted by only 11 days over the last almost 200 years. And when we look at animals, we see some similar patterns of some things showing huge amounts of change and others not as much. This one really jumped out to me because this this is only in the last couple of decades, European adders, which, as you probably remember, reptiles are ectothermic, so they need for it to be warm to be able to be moving around and not be vulnerable to getting eaten themselves, and in order to be able to find food. They brumate, I think it is, by going underground for the winter. And then what causes them to come back out is temperature. Ground temperature warms up and they think, okay, now it's time, it's good. Because we have such more variable temperatures globally, this is from the UK, the the snakes are coming out almost a month earlier just since the 1980s. And that's actually a real problem for their population numbers. It definitely puts them at risk because if it gets cold after they emerge, they're definitely not well positioned to protect themselves. And if it gets, definitely if it freezes, but even if it's not freezing, if it's cool, they get more sluggish. They're definitely a target for getting eaten, and it's harder for them to find food. One thing that I thought was so fascinating when I started to look at, I'm a terrestrial biologist. I mainly study plants, but I really was curious to know, how are aquatic species affected? Is it to the same degree or not as much? And as you could probably guess, the data are very spotty for aquatic and marine systems, just because it's that much harder to sample and understand what's going on. But I found this incredible data set out of Narragansett Bay in Rhode Island, where they have been doing weekly surveys of what fish are present in the bay since the 1950s. And I didn't really even realize this, but I guess it made sense when I started to think about it. There are a lot of marine fish that are migratory and they come into the bay. Some are winter residents and are looking for protection during the winter. Others are summer residents. But as water temperatures have increased, the composition of which species are there when and how long they're spending time there has dramatically shifted. And I was floored to see that certain fish, like this longhorned sculpin, now spends over 100 days less in the bay than it used to back in the 1950s. And several other fish follow suit with their stays being decreased by 2 or 3 months. And then on the flip side, the summer residents are staying a whole lot longer. And so the who of who's there has completely turned inside out in well less than 100 years, which is just kind of mind-blowing to me. I really expected that aquatic things would be more buffered, but it's quite the opposite, actually. Okay, I'm just kind of like throwing little tasters at you, but I wanted to include this one too, because again, things are changing, but that's about the only thing that we can say with confidence because nothing is changing in the same way or consistently. And there was another study out of, this is one of the Dakotas, I think it's South Dakota. Some folks unearthed a really solid data set from 100 years ago and then went out and collected observations on when the same species were flowering in the same location and found all sorts of interesting things. Some species have advanced their flowering times significantly, like we would expect with warmer temperatures, but others are doing completely the opposite. And for example, smooth sumac, for not really clear reason, is actually flowering more than a week later than it did 100 years ago. So these are all open lines of inquiry to be further understood. And then we have plants and animals that are kind of stubborn and aren't really responding much to the changing conditions at all. And this example actually comes from Thoreau's observations and the folks out of Boston University that have been resampling in that area. And what's really fascinating and kind of special and unique about Thoreau's data in particular is that not only did he take really good records of when things were happening, he had some indication of abundance too, of how common different species were on the landscape. And that is a really important piece of the story because the Boston University team is going out and looking at when those same species are doing their activity, undergoing their transitions now, and they can look to see how common they are. And what they have noticed is that, kind of without exception, The species that are very responsive, meaning have shifted their timings substantially in responsive temperature, are doing really well and are actually the ones that are the most common on the landscape. And others that maybe were pretty common in Thoreau's time, if they aren't shifting their timing, and St. John's wort is an example of that, then they're far less common than they used to be. They are kind of losers, really. They're not keeping pace. They now have less access to resources, or at least not priority access anymore, and they're being outcompeted by the plants that are able to keep pace. So we're definitely seeing a wholesale shift in who's present and what they're doing. Okay, that was just a real quick sampler of some of the kinds of things, kinds of ways that we're seeing phenology change. But so what? I'm sure that with this audience, I don't necessarily have to give you ecological or economic consequences. Ecological consequences are enough for sure, but there's definitely economic consequences to this as well. From the ecological side of things, it's pretty logical to think that if you have a big shift in when your particular target species is flowering, then hopefully you also have a consequent shift in the timing of activity for pollinators that have evolved to be present at the same time. Because if not, then both parties miss out. The pollinators can miss out on the food resource that they were hoping for, and the plants can miss out on that pollination service. And it's tricky to pinpoint actual evidence of this, partly because a lot of species are highly adaptable. We have a lot of generalists among both pollinators and plants that usually can tolerate and will appreciate a whole variety of different pollinators. But there are studies underway to try to really narrow in on the extent to which that this is a concern. And definitely in agriculture, it's a big risk and it is a concern. It's coupled with the massive decline in insect numbers overall. And when we don't have pollinators in abundance like bees, we can definitely face problems with not getting crops that we rely upon being pollinated. We definitely are when we see these kinds of changes, meaning warmer temperatures earlier in the year, and especially plant response, meaning flowering or leafing out earlier in the year, we see a much greater risk of what we call false springs. And what that refers to is when you have a very, very early bout of warm conditions that trigger activity among plants and animals. They start to think it's spring, and so they start opening their flowers, putting on their leaves, and emerging. And then we have another big slug of winter, freezing temperatures, ice storms. I know you guys know this well. That is devastating. It can be devastating. And in just the last decade or two, we've had many events in the eastern US where this very sequence has unfolded, and we've had huge crop losses. In 2017, $500 million worth of cherry crops were lost in Michigan because of this kind of set of events. And then we also see similar crop losses when we don't have enough cold in the winter for crops that need to be exposed to a particular amount of chill. Both sets of conditions can really start to impact, especially fruit crops. Allergies is another one. This is such a unpleasant space to work in, really, because as we've pumped more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere and we've raised the temperature of the globe, we've basically given plants the ingredients that they need to grow bigger and more robust and generate more pollen. And that's exactly what they've been doing. And it's a pretty straightforward and unpleasant story that across the US, just since 1990, we've seen the pollen season lengthen by about 3 weeks. And the plants are pumping about 20% more pollen into the air than they used to prior to that time. And it gets even worse because ragweed, one of the plants that's, I'm sure you know, if you suffer from allergies, you know ragweed well. It's very abundant. It's a very opportunistic plant. It'll grow in the crack in the sidewalk and in the ditch behind your house, and it's just spreading like crazy. And it is not only growing more robustly and spreading its distribution, it's actually generating pollen that is more allergenic. So That is a very disappointing consequence of the warmer globe and more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And then festivals. There are across the globe so many local and regional events that are centered around seasonal events in plants or animals. And, and in a lot of cases, they actually bring in a decent amount of income, tourism dollars to that local community. And when the biological event doesn't coincide with the festival that was planned probably a year or two or three in advance to celebrate it, it can be kind of a bust, honestly. I used to live in Holland, Michigan, on the west coast of the state, and they have a huge tulip time festival in May. And there were definitely years where the tulips came up well before tulip time was planned, and then there was lots of wind, and all of the petals blew off, and it was basically stem time when all the tour buses started to roll in, and it just didn't have the same effect. And the city actually has had to move when they host the Tulip Time Festival because the tulips have been coming out progressively earlier in more recent decades. This example on this slide is out of the UK. This Daffodil Festival weekend has shifted 3 weeks since 1969 to try to keep pace with the daffodils that keep emerging earlier and earlier. So any one of those types of change, any of these ways that plants are shifting and animals are shifting the timing of their events can have those kinds of economic consequences. So what can we do about it other than maybe be disappointed and take more allergy medicine? That is where my organization comes in because of this growing recognition of the fact that phenology is indeed shifting in response to warmer temperatures and more variable weather conditions. The USA National Phenology Network was established in 2007, and we primarily exist to keep track of when stuff happens in plants and animals. We coordinate folks all across the country, both professionals and volunteers, in collecting and documenting records of when things are happening. And then my team stores those data. We have a big database and a fancy website and a lot of data access tools. And we make those data readily available for both scientists and researchers to access, decision makers to use in a real-time context, and educators and folks to better understand how things are changing, why we care, how we can use that information, and how we can make decisions that move us in a good direction. So for all of you that are not Nature's Notebook observers yet, I'm going to try and convince you that it's something that you might love to do. And thank you for those of you that are. So Nature's Notebook is a platform that we run, that the USA National Phenology Network coordinates, and it is the platform for tracking plant and animal phenology. It is primarily an app on your phone, but you can also go online and get all the information on the website and print out data sheets and then sit down and transcribe them into a computer interface if you prefer. The core of the app is a set of standardized protocols. So we prompt you with a series of, yeah, I don't have it, shoot. Yes or no questions that you answer. You go out and you make observations on the same individual plants in your yard or on animals in your yard or a convenient location. And every time you go out and make an observation, you are answering a series of questions about what you're seeing. So do you see open flowers? Yes or no? Do you see ripe fruits? Yes or no? And if you say yes, then there are also questions about, well, how many fruits do you see? What percentage of them are ripe? And through all of those different questions, that helps us get a really clear picture of what's happening at a particular location on different organisms and how is it evolving over the season and from one year to the next. We have about 2,000 species available for observing through the platform, and there are an ever increasing suite of training materials that help you get on board and familiarized with how it works and to connect with others too. We have ample webinars and in Zoom meetings and places to interface and ask questions, and then also a lot of self-paced kind of stuff and downloadable stuff too, if that's interesting. And then typically it's a different population of folks that want to analyze the data that are the ones that are collecting it. But we have tools and functionality for anybody to freely either download the data if they so wish, or at least play around with patterns through a visualization tool online. So just for fun, this is a couple of the kinds of plots that you can produce through the visualization tool. The wonderful thing about it is that you don't actually have to download data. You don't have to open Excel or a statistics software or anything. You can just kind of poke around on there, and it pulls from the database directly and plots it for you. And so you can get things like maps of when things are happening across the landscape in a particular year. You can plot variability among years. This is my desert willow in my backyard, and it's showing what was the day of year that plants first had open flowers. The tick marks, every tick mark here is a day that I went out and made an observation. And if it's gray, I said, I do not see open flowers on my desert willow. And if it's pink, it means that I did report that I had open flowers. And so you can see, first of all, when I'm good about observing and when I'm not. I usually have a gap in August. And you can see that when I first reported open flowers does vary a bit from one year to the next, which I think is fascinating. And that is kind of what we're all about here, is understanding, how much does it vary from one year to the next and why? You can also generate plots. This is called an activity curve, but so it's not only showing you when something is happening, but how many of things are happening. One thing that I do want to mention, since I am talking about Nature's Notebook, is that we have this really awesome functionality. Not only can you participate as an individual, but we have really extensive opportunities for groups of folks to participate collectively. And so what this usually looks like is if folks are already organized as a group, they can adopt the activity of observing. And so it's usually things like docents at a nature center or at a national park, or friends groups at a refuge, or master gardeners sometimes at a demonstration garden, any place where people come together already and want to collectively undertake this activity. Classrooms too. Classrooms oftentimes will adopt this. And how it works typically is that the group will agree, these are the particular individual plants on our property or at our institution that we're going to observe. And then they have all sorts of different approaches, but typically they take turns making observations on those same individual plants. And so collectively they're building this data set for the same individual organisms at the location. And they tend to be, it's a really fantastic model because it generates usually observations that are more frequent and that persist for longer. But then you also have this really lovely social aspect where you're coming together with like-minded folks. They usually end up teaching each other a lot of information. And I've heard such cool stories about, they very often have things like potlucks and plant-themed foods like acorn pancakes and oh gosh, I can't remember, mesquite cookies and things like that. And they do book groups, and it's a really cool opportunity to coalesce and come together and learn about plants while also contributing to a really important activity. Oh, my map got cut off. Okay, so for fun, this is how much data has come into Nature's Notebook since we launched the program in 2009. And so the dots here represent all the different sites that have contributed observations, and the size of the circle and the color represent how many. So you can see that we have a lot of variability in how much data are being collected at different locations. There's definitely opportunities for gap filling here, but it's growing. And I wanted to look specifically at what was going on in Illinois. This is not the loveliest map because the border of the state is kind of hard to see, but I know you all know what your state looks like. What this plot is just the existing local phenology programs. So again, those groups that are collecting data as a group. And if the pin is gray, it means that they're not currently active. And if it's green, they are currently active. So this map is screen capped from a tool on our website that you can go in and explore. So if you happen to be, if you live in the Bloomington area and you're curious to know who that group is, and I don't know off the top of my head, we can find out, and it may be something that you can join into if you're interested. Also, for fun, I just wanted to see how things were going in Illinois. So, right before this talk, I grabbed all of the data that have been contributed to Nature's Notebook in the state of Illinois since we launched. And so, what we're looking at here is each bubble is a different site. And so if you are one of the observers and you registered a site in your yard, then your yard shows up as one of these bubbles. And if you observed in more than 1 year, then you have more than one bubble because the colors represent the sites in the years. So you can see in 2009, the dark blue, we didn't have that many active sites in Illinois, but now coming out to the farther bubbles, we have more and the bubbles are bigger, which means that there were more records coming in from those sites in those years. And so that's encouraging for sure. And all those data set us up to be able to answer questions along the lines of something like, are we starting to see changes in, say, nectar or pollen availability? And so this is just a conceptual example of if you had 5 different species and they all flowered at different times, but overlapping times of the growing season, then that's a good thing because there's always something available for critters and insects that are looking for pollen. But if we start to have changes and some of those flowering times either shift or contract, we may actually start to have experiences like this where we could start to see a gap emerging in pollen availability or nectar availability. And so that's one of the many reasons why we're coordinating folks on the ground, collecting data and trying to answer those kinds of questions. And so for fun, I can show you just a couple of examples of how the data have been used. We've had over 200 studies now that have been published that have used Nature's Notebook data in one way or another. And I'll give you just a couple of really quick examples of what that can look like. This was a study where a researcher said, I know that urban areas tend to be warmer than the surrounding landscape. And what we know from earlier in the talk, when temperatures are warmer, plants typically seem to leaf out or flower earlier. And so, what do we see when we look at urban versus rural across the landscape? Does it mean that trees in more urban environments leaf out or flower sooner? And now that I'm saying this, I'm realizing I'm actually talking this one. He did the same researcher did the study for spring and fall, but this is the fall one. So we have to go to the end of the season. And it's the opposite. What we see is the growing season lengthening typically when temperatures are warmer. Trees will hold on to their leaves longer into the fall when it's warmer. And so typically, and what we might expect to see is that trees in urbanized areas where we have warmer temperatures, we would expect that they would hold on to their leaves later than the surrounding landscape that wasn't as warm. And so he pulled Nature's Notebook observations from all across the whole country and looked at that very pattern. And that's what we see in this plot. What we have on the x-axis is basically a measure of urbanization. They used human population density, but the on the far left is less developed areas, and then as we get to the right, it's the more developed, the higher density population, so more your cities. And then on the y-axis here, we have the day of year when the leaves changed colors and started to drop. And what he did was split the country up by latitude. So we have very low latitude and then progressing northward. So if we look at this purple line, this is the highest latitudes or the areas with the coolest temperatures annually. And when we look at just that line, we see exactly that relationship where the least developed areas are where the trees where their leaves senesce the earliest in the year. And then as we progress this way, we get to increasingly more developed, deeper more dense populations. We tend to see that the leaf senescence goes later into the year. And that's exactly what he expected to see. Except that only really held at the highest latitudes. And as we move through these different blue and green lines, we're actually moving down towards the south. And as we progress south, this relationship continues to weaken. And then when we get to this yellow line, we're actually at the most southernmost reaches of Texas and Florida, where it's kind of aseasonal. We actually see the inverse relationship there. So this was really fascinating and a really novel use of the data. All these observations of leaf senescence have been contributed by all these different people across the country with no expectation that they would be used in this kind of discovery. And what's so cool is the researcher not only verified that that relationship that he expected to occur did indeed exist, he was able to show that it doesn't hold for every part of the country. He was able to see the very variable pattern across space, and he could only do that because we have data coming in from all across the country. So it really speaks to the value of a national scale program like this. Okay, I'll give you one more example and then I'll move on because I know we're running out of time. And forgive me because I'm going to talk about poplars and I know these are pictures of willow and I didn't have time to swap them out, but this is another really fascinating example of looking at how changes in phenology manifest in dioecious plants. So you probably know most plants have male and female flowers on the same individual. And actually, most of them have both male and female flower parts in the same flowers. And sometimes they can even fertilize themselves, but usually you need pollen exchange among individuals. But there are less than 10% of the angiosperms, the flowering plants, are dioecious, meaning that you have only male flowers on some individuals and only female flowers on the other individuals. Okay, so poplars are some of those, and so are willows. It's an interesting question, and this is what these researchers pose. They know we have already seen from the literature that the timing of leaf out and flowering in poplars is advancing. It is sensitive to temperature, and so as global temperatures have increased, the timing of leaf out and flowering has shifted earlier. But what they really wanted to know was, does it vary among males and females? Because if the male plants shift more to a greater extent than the female plants, and you don't, or vice versa, and you don't have them flowering at the same time, then you really can face trouble with pollination. You must have that pollen available when the female flowers are open so that you can get the pollen there and complete fertilization. Also, it matters to know whether the timing of leaf out and flowering are shifting at the same rate because these plants are wind pollinated. Most dioecious plants are wind pollinated. So they're relying on wind currents to take their loads of pollen and pick them up and move them over to the female plants, wherever they might be. And if you've got leaves in the way, then that makes it harder for fertilization to occur. And so most of these dioecious wind pollinated plants flower before they leaf out. But again, we know both of those events are shifting in time. Are they shifting at the same rate? Or are we going to run into trouble? If we see leaf out advancing more rapidly than flowering, then we might experience more interference from those leaves and again be problematic for the plants. So the researchers collected up data from all across the country through Nature's Notebook, as well as from herbarium records, and they posed those two questions. And what they found was, first of all, when looking at the male and the female situation, both are shifting, but the male plants are advancing to a greater degree than female plants. Whoops. So that's not great. So far, it appears that the flowering times in both male and female plants still overlap. And so there is still an opportunity for fertilization to occur. However, if things continue on this trajectory, it could be bad news for these plants. Then when we look at the timing of leaf out and flowering, we see a greater advancement among the timing of flowering compared to leaf out. So that's actually a good thing because that means that there is a greater opportunity for those flowers to become fertilized before they start experiencing leaf interference. So it's a messy story, but it might be that these two things kind of cancel each other out, at least for a while. And maybe we could slow the trajectory of things advancing and going off the rails, and maybe it will be okay. Also, plants are adaptable and adaptation is always occurring. And so I don't want to leave you with a sense of doom, but rather, this is an example of the kinds of research that is made possible because of the data that are coming in through Nature's Notebook. And what's so cool is these researchers are now extending this exact study to other taxa as well, because it's a really compelling question. Okay, if you're interested in hearing about more of this, one of the things I can point you to is that on our website, whenever, I'm going to say not quite whenever, but almost whenever a paper gets published that uses Nature's Notebook data, we prepare these summaries, which are public-friendly short summaries that help communicate what the study showed and how the Nature's Notebook data were useful. And if you are a member, you will get these notifications through email. And what we're now starting to do is even keep track of the exact records that were used in the analysis and then email folks directly saying your observations were part of this study so that you can really see the impact that your efforts have. I want to make a plug that if you are interested in Nature's Notebook, you're welcome to go to the Apple Store, iTunes, or Google Play and download it right now. But we're so close to it being so much better. And I have March 15th on here because we've been undertaking a massive overhaul of the app and exactly how it works and what your onboarding experience is like and how you are introduced into the experience of observing and how everything functions. And it's set to, the first iteration of that is set to launch on March 15th, if all goes well. And I put these screen caps in here because it probably doesn't mean a whole lot for those of you that have never heard of Nature's Notebook before, but for those of you that do use the app, it'll be a massive improvement. And I might just say that you might want to hold off until we launch this because it'll be such a better experience. But you can go um, sign up for our newsletters, which I have a link in here in a second. And even if you just go to the website, you can sign up to get notifications about this so that you don't forget. One other thing that I'll quickly mention, because this is one other thing that we do too, and I'm not going to go deep on it, but you might have seen a map that looks like this, maybe in the news before, either on TV or in print or online media, because one thing that we do is in addition to hosting Nature's Notebook and trying to encourage folks to contribute and then use the observations, we produce a series of real-time forecasts for when things are occurring. So we take those observational data and parlay them into actionable maps that indicate when things are occurring or expected to occur across the whole country. And the product that is far and away the most widely received by especially the news media is the spring anomaly map. And so basically what it is that we take the conditions that are associated with the very beginning of biological spring and determine when locations reach those conditions in the spring. And then we compare that with when they usually are reached, meaning the last 3 decades. And that's what this map shows. And so if a location is shaded blue, it means those conditions associated with the start of spring occurred later than average in that year. And if it's red, it means that those conditions were reached earlier than average. This is the map from last year. And so it was kind of a slow start to spring. A lot of the southern states it was just cold earlier in the year, very early in the year, like January. And we didn't reach the conditions associated with the very beginning of biological activity until a couple of weeks later than they usually are reached in those southern states. And the same was true in the middle states, but a lot of where you all are at, actually, it was warmer in parts of the spring such that we reached that start of spring several weeks earlier than average last year. Um, and I can say more about that if you're interested, but keep your eyes on we have these on our website. We update them nightly and they do end up in the news pretty regularly too, especially when it's very red. When we have a very early start to spring in the southern states and this whole thing comes out red, then it ends up on the news a lot. And we also, in a similar vein, produce a suite of forecasts for particular pest species and when to take action for them. And I can say more about that if you're interested. I'm going to skip that part. It's boring. It's for funders. This is the link where you can learn more and you can sign up for our newsletters if you're interested. usanpn.org is the website. And if you scroll to the bottom of the page, the Get Our Newsletters link is there. And if you're interested in Nature's Notebook, for sure, sign up for the one that's the narrative. It's the Nature's Notebook narrative. And that is where we will absolutely be keeping everybody up to date on the progress of the new app for sure. And then here's a couple of other, that's the link again. You can, if you're interested, sign up for Nature's Notebook, explore the maps and forecasts further, which aren't doing much yet. They will in the next few weeks. Usually by the beginning of February, things are starting to show on that start of spring map. There's some social media stuff. And one other thing I'll mention, because I forgot to before, is that if you're interested in this topic, I had a book come out last spring and it's pretty short. It's just a little like pocket guide to the topic. Um, Basically because one didn't exist previous and it goes into much greater depth on all the stuff that I talked about today. You can get it directly from Penguin Random House and get 20% off with that code. But I'll also say you can get it on Amazon for about 12 bucks or 10 if you're a Kindle person. So choose your poison. You can you can get it online through Barnes and Noble and Target and all the rest, but generally they aren't stocking it. And with that, I will stop and take questions if you're still hanging in there, and I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Wow, Teresa, that was fantastic. So much information in there that it's hard. We've had a lot of good observations in the chat room. Different people have noticed things locally in terms of animals and plants coming out early. One question that I had is how is moisture taken into consideration in all of this?
Yeah, largely, it's a really good question. I'm going to try not to ramble too much. Um, Largely in the eastern US, things are temperature limited. Largely, you all have things go dormant right now because it's cold. It's cold and it's dark, and it really takes temperature, warmth, and then day length to trigger plants and animals to kind of come back out and do their thing. We do see the impact, though, of limited moisture, especially in the autumn in the east. It can really diminish leaf color change. It can cause things to go, trees to just basically drop their leaves with very little color or have a very dull or limited period of time where there's color or just duller colors. But moisture plays a very important role out here where I'm at, and in other deserts and semi-arid systems where water is the limiting factor. It's kind of the flip here where I'm at, where we are largely not temperature limited. It never really gets that cold here in southern Arizona, but what limits species from being active all year round is access to moisture. And so we have very distinct growing seasons where plants and animals do respond when there is rainfall, and without the rainfall, they're just staying chill. They're sitting still. And so that's a really good question that it does play a key role. And that's again a very broad brush kind of answer, but I'm trying to be brief.
No, that's interesting, and thank you. Um, Got several questions in here. Let me go back through a few of them. One question was, why is there more pollen? You said there's 20% more
Yeah,
pollen for the allergy. Why is that?
basically it is the fact that we are fertilizing, we are indirectly, inadvertently fertilizing those plants. With the warmer temperatures, the longer growing season, and more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. If you think back to your photosynthesis lessons from elementary school or middle school, plants take in sunlight and carbon dioxide to grow and give us oxygen and plant material. And with the inputs, more inputs, outputs are increased as well. And so again, that's a oversimplification, but it really is a pretty well documented pattern here that again, it's wind pollinated plants. I should distinguish. It's not all plants. It's not all plants. It's the wind pollinated plants that we care about because those largely are the ones that are producing the pollen that we are allergic to, and that is, the grains are small enough that they're picked up by the wind and carried on in the air, and then we get them in our airways. But yeah, we are basically feeding our plants more of what they need to pump out more pollen.
Makes perfect sense. We did have somebody in here who writes for the Illinois Audubon magazine and wondering if he can get access to more information to write an article
Yes,
about
that
some
would be
Illinois data.
fantastic. Yes, so I'll put my email in the chat
Okay,
again in case you missed it. And any of you are welcome to follow up with me that way. That's probably the first step. But yes, I'd love to.
great. Thank you very much. That's very, very kind of you. Um, a question about iNaturalist. They've recently added some
Ah.
phenology things to their site. Is there any partnership between your groups?
Yes, yes, there is. Thank you so much for asking that. I have got to build a slide out for that. We have a good, strong relationship with iNaturalist. And actually they inspired some of the changes that we're making to our app because they have just grown exponentially where we have had steady, slow growth. Part of that is because their model for engagement is so different. It's so easy to take an observation anywhere at any time of anything using iNaturalist. And what we're after is really the building the long-term records of repeated observations through time. So we know we're asking for a lot, but yes, they have now, if you're an iNat person, you'll know that there's a lot of optional fields that you can fill out when you're making an observation and phenology. Some of the basic, we call them phenophases, are included. And we did work closely with their team to make sure that the language that they're using in how they're defining open flowers and ripe fruits are the same language that we use, because then researchers that want to combine the two data sets at the end have a much easier, it's just much easier to do. And there actually is a lot of active research happening now to make that much more possible. Also, some of the new functionality in the new version of the Nature's Notebook app that's going to go live includes the ability to take pictures of your organism and they'll go straight to iNaturalist from the Nature's Notebook app, and the two records will be connected behind the scene. So the phenology will be stored in our database and the photo will be stored in iNaturalist. And again, an end user can get all that stuck together if you want. And iNat has this amazing computer vision capacity for species identification, where you can basically hold your phone up to a organism if you don't know what it is and say, "What the heck is this?" And it will help you identify it. And that has been a weak spot for us because we basically have to trust that observers know what they're observing. And when they tell us these are records on a red maple, we just have to trust that, yep, that's a red maple. And this now being able to leverage the iNaturalist species identification functionality will shore that up significantly. So yes, we're very excited about that.
Oh, that sounds fantastic. I'm guessing this is not an easy and short answer, but what can we do about this to prevent the tipping point of pollination timing mismatch and species survival? Kind of how
Yeah,
do we save the world?
I'm going to say that you do what you can do. I feel like first and foremost, we have to not panic. We have to keep our own emotions in check. We have to feed ourselves, feed our mental state and um, stay right-headed, cool-headed about everything. And I feel like one of the number one ways that we can do that is to spend time in nature and to really connect more with other living things. And then it's so easy to get so overwhelmed by the magnitude of these problems. And I really feel like that can be just absolutely, that can make you just shut down, and that doesn't help. The best thing that you can do is keep taking some kind of action at the scale that is right for you. And so if that means that you can contribute some observations through Nature's Notebook or even iNaturalist, that is fantastic. If it means that you can't, that's okay too. But whatever, I feel like it's a really personal answer to that. Um, Finding the ways that you can to connect with others, to find more information, feel more empowered. I feel like it's all of that.
Indeed. And hopefully you can find everyone that's listening can find your tribe within the Wild Ones community too. I think
Yeah,
that
such a
we
great group. I was part of the group when I was in Kalamazoo, and it was just such a great group.
uh, I I'm biased, but I agree. Another question, are you losing funding from government organizations?
Such a good question. Thank you. I didn't update my slide. Oh, we have had, okay, I'll try to answer this briefly too. The short answer is not yet. Because we actually lost our funding back in 2020. When our program first launched in 2007, we were largely supported by the US Geological Survey. And that sustained up until 2020, which was during the first Trump administration and when cuts were being made to natural resources. Because we are a program that's stationed at a university and we were receiving money from a federal agency, the federal agency said we have to prioritize our own people, and because we're facing a budget cut, we have to stop sending money out to the university and we're going to keep it here. And so we haven't had sustaining funding from the USGS or any other organization since that time. And what has sustained us instead since that time has been grants from the National Science Foundation. We achieved a federal appropriation for the last few years. Several smaller scale grants from agencies and other funding organizations. And then most recently, I need to do a huge shout out. The Moore Foundation has come through and provided us with significant funding. And I'm so grateful. We're so grateful because that was a just in time kind of situation. So because of that, we are in decent shape. And also because we had a federal appropriation a couple of years ago and we keep having a continuing resolution that actually works in our favor. And I was just talking with folks at USGS earlier today, and it sounds like a continuing resolution may go through again, which, be that as it may, has a lot of implications, but the short version of that is if everything goes as we hope it does, that would actually result in more money for us, which is funny because I'm sure that's the exact opposite of what the original intention was. And I probably should stop talking now.
We will keep our fingers crossed for you.
Thank you. Thank
You
you.
have, I think, convinced all of us that you're doing great work here. We
Thanks.
have a question from Marcia. Is there a document tracking prevailing winds during each season and the impact?
Such a good question. So that's definitely outside of my realm of expertise. There are wind resources, and I don't think I could do any better than Googling it, honestly. For example, I know that the National Weather Service, that's one of um, mm, the things that they track at all the different weather stations. Compiling it into big maps is work that others do. It's not something that has been integrated with phenology to a great degree. However, I imagine this question might come from the allergy side of things. It's really cool. We are part of a project that was just funded by NASA, and it's going to result in real-time forecasts of cedar pollen in central Texas. We've been trying to work with different researchers for many years to come up with real-time airborne pollen concentration maps because that data is actually extremely limited, honestly. There are a lot of pollen forecasts out there, but the truth is that they aren't really based on much actual data that has been sampled in the real world. It's a lot of weird proxy stuff like sales of allergy medication and stuff like that. And so we're working with some researchers I'm going to try and shortcut this, basically try to predict where and when pollen is going to be in the air. And it involves phenology people, modeling people, remote sensing people, which is people that are looking at stuff from sensors born on satellites, and an atmospheric dynamicist because they're trying to bring all that stuff into the mix, and it's really complicated. And the NPN's role primarily is in getting people to make observations on the cedar plants so that we can validate that yes, things are, pollen is out in the air and this is right. And then more importantly, maybe to deliver those maps in real-time formats, because that's a resource. Our website really is kind of looked to as a trustworthy resource for this. And we have groups like the Today Show that come to us on an annual basis asking for our maps. And crazy enough, the graphics guy from the Today Show has come to me about 5 years in a row saying, "Do you have those pollen maps yet? Do you have those pollen maps yet?" And so that was, part of what prompted this grant to come together. And still, it's still just a baby step because it's only going to be for cedar and it's only in Central Texas, but it is working out, establishing the workflows of bringing in all these data sources together, figuring out how to process it and generate these real-time maps that can then be distributed through, the news media and our website and even like allergists' offices and that kind of thing. That really is the intention here is it's a very, very practical intersection between what plants are doing when they're doing it and our just our general well-being, honestly.
No, I thought you made a lot of really interesting observations. I never even considered economic impact in all of this. I was just thinking ecological. So that interesting. Joy asked a question, are there resources to help groups get started? She's
Yes.
putting together a page for her Virginia Master Naturalist chapter.
Yes, definitely. Joy, would you mind emailing me directly? Because there's so much. And I would love to connect you with. We've got a couple of amazing members on our team who help onboard groups. And one of the things that you might be interested in knowing about is that it may be a little too much too soon, but we have a 10-week certification course for folks that want to start, who want to establish a local phenology program. And it walks you through all the stuff that I did, but in way more detail and in a very interactive way, as well as program planning. So mechanical things like what are the goals I'm trying to achieve, and how do I best link this to, say, if you're associated with an institution, how do I make sure that there's sustainability there? How do I recruit people? How do I keep them active? How do I use your visualization tool? How do I, all the things. So definitely I can connect you with all that. It's we keep getting rave reviews on it. And I don't mind saying that because it's not me that's running it. It's my amazing team.
Great. And one question from very early on from Paul Brown was, what species of squirrel's ears do you use to determine when to plant the corn?
It's funny. I don't know. They say I hear it in mouse ears too.
Ah,
Yeah, I don't
okay.
know.
Well,
I don't
we'll
know
just
my
have
small
to,
mammals very well.
no, we'll just have to keep watching those squirrels and see if we can figure it out ourselves then. But the chat is absolutely filled with thank yous and appreciations and compliments about the interesting information. So thank you again so much for
Can I,
that.
can I ask one more question,
Oh,
Anne,
absolutely, Barry.
before we go?
Sorry.
Somebody put it out there. If we get the app today, will we get a notification to update it to the new
Yes,
app? And will the old app
yes.
change? Yes.
Yes,
Okay.
and yes, and all the things. I don't actually know all of the details on that, but I know that the team is working on that. I think what the plan is that there will be ample messaging, and when the new one's live, you'll get a notification in when you open it up, a prompt to go download it. But I believe that we will be maintaining the old one for some period of time. There will be some overlap, because we know, first of all, not everybody will download the new one on the first day. And some folks, we've even heard some folks have trainings planned for, late March. And they were like, what? We can't have a new training, a training that we've already scheduled on a new app. So there will be some overlap. But yes, definitely we will direct everybody because we will want very much, and you will want to, I promise, to get the new app.
All right, that's fantastic. If we don't see any other questions come in, I think we will just thank you one more time for um, joining us tonight and sharing your work with us. It's opened up a lot of eyes into the types of work that researchers are doing out there. So thank you so much.
Yes, and thank you all for hanging in there. Thank you for being here on a cold, dark evening on a Monday night. I really appreciate
Well,
the opportunity.
yes, and should you ever make your way back through here, we would be happy to take you back through the prairies again.
I honestly would relish that. That sounds so great. Thank you.
All right. Well, thanks again and good night, everyone. Be sure to register for our next program on February 9th with Ethan Tapper and How to Love a Forest. And don't miss Sherry teaching how to winter sow native plants at the Bloomington Library on January 25th. All right. Good night, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.